One of the biggest concerns that people have about the state of the world is the violence that they see across the world. And is violence going to go away? Evidence indicates that violence is a part of the human condition. Aggressive responses are here to stay because they work under many conditions. So we learn to be aggressive to get our way. But as we'll talk about, humans do have a natural tendency to dislike aggression. We don't like seeing other people get hurt. We actually have kind of an instinct, a flinching response, where we don't like to hurt other people. Knowing that, but knowing that a lot of violence does occur in the world, under what conditions do people view violence as an acceptable way to get what they want in the world? Well, like many of the other topics in this class, we're going to divide this into that person and environment interaction to create behavior. This is a great application of the idea that both person variables and environment variables have to mix together to create certain behavior. I want to start us off with an example of an experiment that displays this really well. Cohen and colleagues in the 90s performed an experiment where they had participants from different parts of the country come into their building and go into a psychology lab, a room, take some surveys, do some stuff, and then the experimenter would tell the participants, we need you to walk down the hallway to another room to finish the experiment. There's a task in that other room you need to go to. Now, they were investigating some person variables because I'll explain in a minute. They divided their participants into two different categories based on where in the country those participants were from. They also changed an environment variable because when participants in their study walked down the hallway to get to the next room, they were randomly divided into two different groups. So they experienced one of two different scenarios. They got to the next room, they completed some tasks, including some cognitive tasks to see how aggressive those participants were feeling. And this is a great example of clever research methods used in psychology because we can't directly measure how aggressive someone is feeling by giving them the opportunity to punch someone else or hurt someone else. So Cohen and colleagues used a study design where they had some cognitive tasks, such as a word completion task, where participants they're given a word with some blank letters in it. It can be filled in with either an aggressive answer or a non-aggressive answer. So people who are feeling more aggressive would be more likely to put the word as an aggressive word. All right, back to the person and situation variables. Where were these two groups of participants from? The authors divided them into people who were from the southern United States or the northern United States. And now we'll talk about exactly how they made that distinction later on in the presentation, but when they looked at things in general, they didn't find much aggression difference between northern and southern United States if they looked at that alone. But I mentioned they had another manipulation, an independent variable, where some participants, when they walked from one room to the other, they encountered a frustrating scenario. The hallway was narrow. There was a filing cabinet in the way, and when they tried to get from one side to the other, there was a filing cabinet and there was a person in the hallway. So it was frustrating because they both had to kind of squeeze by each other so they could get to the next room. That was the control group. In the experimental group, which, by the way, there were actually 3 studies. You can go read more about this. I'm kind of combining info from all 3 studies. So in one group, it was just frustrating because they had to get by another person. But in another group, that person, who, by the way, was an actor, they were part of the study, would intentionally, as they were trying to get through the narrow hallway, bump into the participant and call them an asshole. Now, like I said, the participant would then go to the end of the hallway into the next room where they would be completing some tasks. Now, if you looked at things on average, people from the North versus the South didn't display huge differences. But if we divided people into North versus South and control group versus getting bumped and called a name by that person, Northerners who were called a name did not change their aggressiveness very much between whether they just had to go down a narrow hallway or somebody bumped into them and called them an asshole. Southerners, on the other hand, here's where we saw a big difference. People who were from the South and just had to get by another person, they were not aggressive at all. They were being polite to the other person. They just wanted to complete their psychology study. But Southerners, when that person bumped into them and called them an asshole, on all of the aggression tasks that they had to complete, they always went for the most aggressive response. So they would fill in their word completion task with aggressive answers. If they had the opportunity to hurt somebody else with a small electrical shock, they would pick the largest electrical shock that they could. This was a classic person and environment interaction. We didn't find a difference between these two groups of people in one condition, but put them in a frustrating situation where somebody insults them, suddenly there's a huge behavior change. What's going on here? I'll actually reveal the answer later in this very presentation. But before we get to that, we're going to go back to the beginning and go over some basic vocabulary. Now, when I am talking as a social psychologist, like during this lecture, I use the word aggression very specifically to mean any behavior with the intention to harm someone else who does not wish to be harmed. So with that in mind, looking at this photo, does it appear that aggressive behavior is happening according to this photo? Well, a social psychologist would not consider this aggression because this is an activity, a social activity, where both parties have consented to use potentially harmful actions against each other. If you're playing football and somebody tackles you, we don't consider that aggression. So aggression is just when you're harmed or harming someone else and consent isn't there. Violence is aggression meant to inflict extreme harm, so physical hurt or debilitation against someone else. So there are a lot of aggressive actions that are not violent. Relational aggression is an example of this, which is aggression against someone else through maybe nonverbal means. Bullying them, trying to hurt their self-esteem. That's aggression, but it's not violence. Direct aggression or physical aggression is when you're trying to physically injure someone else. Indirect is when you're not physically touching them, but you're still trying to inflict some harm, such as psychological harm. Now I'm going to divide this entire presentation up into person differences, followed by environment or situation differences. Here are some of the person differences we need to talk about at the beginning. Let's start with genetics. Is there evidence that our genes influence how aggressive we are? The first place I would look for evidence of whether genes can influence aggression is comparing humans to other species, because we have a lot of research accumulated over a lot of time about other animals and whether they are more aggressive than each other, or whether some members of a species are more aggressive than other members of a species. We know that chimpanzees, humans, and bonobos are all highly genetically related to each other. We share about 98% of our genes, but bonobos aren't aggressive or violent at all. Chimpanzees are hyper-violent. Humans, somewhere in the middle. Could those genetic differences between our species be what makes one more aggressive than the other? Well, let's think about dogs for a minute. Dogs can be bred to be more or less aggressive. But I think this is a great example of thinking about how genes must interact with the environment. I asked some people that I'm friends with to send me pictures of their dogs, which are very traditionally, they're known stereotypically to be very violent breeds. So they sent me some really scary pictures of their dogs acting as violent as they could get. These are the most violent pictures they had. Um, as you can see, there's a gene and environment interaction here where even though these dogs are parts of breeds that are traditionally known to be more aggressive, if they're raised in an environment where aggression is not rewarded, they don't end up being very aggressive in their behavior. So, could humans be the same way? Do we have evidence that certain genes are related to more aggressive behavior in humans? Well, research has been done. Twin studies, for example, we can compare identical twins who share most of their genes and most of their gene expression to fraternal twins who show their genes are not the same and their genetic expression thus is very different. We find in studies like that identical twins, their aggressive tendencies are more closely related to each other than fraternal twins. But in both of those cases, if you have a twin who is identical, you know how aggressive they are. You can't perfectly predict how aggressive their twin is. There's not a perfect relationship. What about particular genes? Do we have evidence that there are some genes that do something maybe to your brain or to your body that make you more aggressive? When I went looking for this, it's actually hard to find genes that predispose somebody toward aggression. But there are some genes that potentially predispose you to be more aggressive under stressful circumstances. This group of researchers from Spain, for example, they published a study in Genes, Brain, and Behavior where they were looking at whether people who had differences in a certain gene, MAOA, then measured their response to different situations. No differences were found in aggression if their participants were placed in a situation that was not very stressful. But if they gave some participants a stressful task, like a social exclusion task, they put them in a situation where it appeared that no one wanted to be around them, they were socially excluded from a group, and then measured their aggressive responses using psychology tasks, they found that individuals with low activity of that MAOA gene were more aggressive under that stressful environment. So, yes, is there a link between genetics and aggression? The answer is yes. But there's always a gene and environment interaction where those aggressive tendencies have to be activated by some external situational pressure for us to see the differences. Here are more dogs that these are the most violent pictures my friends could find of their animals. So yes, there is a link between genetics and aggression. However, that's only part of the story. We're going to continue talking about differences in learning history and other factors where it appears that aggression as a response of animals, including humans, aggression as a response must be rewarded for us to see it as a valuable response. If we grow up, or if we're raised, like you raise your dog, in an environment where they learn that aggression does not reward them, they're less likely to engage in aggressive behavior. So we've talked about genetic differences, but those genes have to do something. What do they do to our body or our brain that causes some people to be more prone to aggression or others? Well, these are the brain areas that are most closely related to aggressive behavior. Damage to one of these areas, for example, is likely to lead to more aggression. The frontal lobe, we've talked about in other parts of class, is involved in a lot of our sense of self-control. So if the frontal lobe is disabled, either by being damaged, such as a car accident, a stroke. If the frontal lobe is disabled, then you have the same aggressive thoughts and tendencies as other people, but you're less able to control whether you act on them or not. Though it appears that most people have the same aggressive options. We realize if someone insults us or is bothering us, we can respond violently to them. But we don't pick that option because we realize that it's socially inappropriate. Damage to the frontal lobe removes our self-control, makes us more impulsive. The amygdala and the hypothalamus are also linked with aggressive tendencies. Damage to the hypothalamus can lead people to ignoring violence as an option entirely, or damage to the hypothalamus can lead to people always responding violently to certain outcomes. It depends on where the damage is, whether the hypothalamus up or down regulates your aggressive response. Obviously, we don't damage people's hypothalamus on purpose in humans, but in rat models, we see that damage to certain areas of the hypothalamus makes them unable to respond aggressively, even if it's to save their own life. We can experimentally damage the hypothalamus of a rat and then place it in the same enclosure as a cat, and it won't respond by fighting for its life. Its aggressive response is gone. In other situations, damage to the hypothalamus, such as in humans, individuals that have a tumor that's pressing up against that area of the brain, can lead to invasive thoughts of violent behavior or less ability to control our violent outbursts because the hypothalamus is signaling that aggression is a necessary action in response to the environment, even if our environment is very friendly and not threatening. The amygdala is closely linked with emotional processing, and the heightened sense of awareness and fear and aggression that we have when the environment calls for an aggressive response appears to be handled by the amygdala as well. There are two hormones I want to highlight that help explain the relation between brain activity and aggression. That's testosterone and serotonin. Serotonin helps regulate our mood, and we have found in studies that look at genetic differences in people's response with serotonin that individuals that are better able to regulate their mood under stressful circumstances are less likely to engage in aggressive responses. So serotonin helps us regulate our response. So maybe we get frustrated and we want to respond aggressively, but we learn to self-control that behavior. The relationship between testosterone and aggression, you can find hundreds of studies that find a relationship. The correlation between testosterone and aggression is probably, according to the latest meta-analyses, it's a weak correlation, but it is present. The more testosterone in your body, the more likely you are to respond with aggression. Men tend to have higher levels of testosterone than women, which may help explain why there's differences in aggression between men and women. But the relationship between testosterone and aggression, although it's there, notice I'm being careful not to say that testosterone causes aggression. It's actually incredibly difficult to scientifically establish that testosterone causes aggression because we know that testosterone changes our behaviors, so it's possible that testosterone makes us more aggressive, but we also know that engaging in aggressive behavior changes our hormone levels. So establishing that testosterone is the cause rather than the effect of aggression is actually difficult. It's probably a mix of both. Let's talk about some of the evidence. Yes, testosterone is related to aggression, but that relationship is moderated by several different variables. I've listed a few of them here, but these are not the only ones. So what does it mean for testosterone and aggression to have moderating variables? That means that the relationship between testosterone and aggression gets higher or lower at different levels of these other variables. With age, for example, younger people, kids, for example, their testosterone levels don't appear very related to their aggressive responses. But then we have certain combinations, such as teenage boys, where testosterone levels fluctuate and aggression tends to fluctuate. So for certain groups, responding to that influx of this hormone might lead to less impulse control, more aggression. Stress is another very important moderator because many of the differences in aggression I'm talking about through this presentation are actually not present unless you put people into a stressful situation. When stress levels are high, there might be more pronounced differences in aggression between groups of people. Testosterone is also not the only hormone involved. Serotonin is another hormone in the brain, or neurotransmitter in the brain, and hormone that works throughout the body. Cortisol is a stress hormone that influences several bodily systems. Under high levels of cortisol exposure, testosterone might cause an increased aggressive response. When under low cortisol levels, it wouldn't. We do have the understanding that testosterone is related to aggression. It's possible that testosterone changes how we respond to certain situations. So one perspective that I thought was very informative is that it's not that testosterone causes us to be aggressive necessarily. It's that everyone has aggressive tendencies, but testosterone changes the way you view the world. So it may make an aggressive response feel more appropriate under certain circumstances than it otherwise would. Next, let's talk about there are two viewpoints. These are the only viewpoints, but there are two prevailing viewpoints to help explain the fact listed on this slide that men tend to commit most violent crimes, especially when physical violence is used. But how can we explain this? What could be the cause for this? There's social role theory is the view that these gender differences, just like many other gender differences discussed throughout the course, are due to the different social roles that men and women play in our culture. Right now, the global Western monoculture that we're all a part of has certain expectations of men's behavior and women's behavior, and those expectations include different expectations about when it is appropriate to respond with aggression or violence and when it isn't. So maybe under this explanation, men commit more violence because it is more socially appropriate under more circumstances for men to commit more violence. The second viewpoint is that the gender differences we see are due to sexual selection. That's an evolutionary pressure that drives differences between male and female members of any species, including humans. Now, is there evidence that supports one of these theories but not the other? Probably the reality is most likely that both of these contribute to the differences we see in differences between humans. We know, for example, that humans are not a very sexually dimorphous species compared to most. The physical and psychological differences between men and women, humans, is much smaller than the physical differences between like male and female chimpanzees. That being said, we're more sexually dimorphous than what you'd expect from, or what you'd see from a typical member of some other species. I made the comparison before of chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans. All very similar genetically, all with a very similar body shape, but humans have differences that are somewhere probably in between chimpanzees and bonobos. The gender differences we see in violence are probably partially explained by these genetic evolved differences and partially explained by this acculturation process. Because even if we start with evolved differences, if a culture doesn't place any emphasis on those differences and says the script for men and women should be the same, well, you'd expect us to be the same. But on the other hand, if the cultural expectations are that there should be differences, and whether or not genetics says there will be differences, there will be differences due to those cultural expectations. There's not really evidence that supports one of these views or the other. Like I said, it's probably a mix of both. Now, we do have evidence bearing on this issue. We find that sex differences in verbal aggression are very small. Sex differences in physical aggression are somewhat bigger when it comes to just aggression differences. Now, what explains these differences? According to one review, the most accurate viewpoint is probably that men and women experience similar levels of anger, but men choose different actions in response to that anger. In other words, because of a combination of genetic differences, hormonal differences, and culture, it is more acceptable for men to choose more violent options under more circumstances than it is for women. So far, we've been talking about person differences at a level of analysis that focuses on biological, genes and physical characteristics, but we need to also look at person differences that are psychological, such as personality, learning history, your own personal beliefs. So let's move into that area. We're going to start off with personality. Are there personality traits, differences between people that might predispose you to be more or less likely to engage in violence or aggressive behavior? Probably it should be the number one on this slide is impulsivity. People that are more impulsive tend to choose violence, choose aggression more often. Next, I want to mention self-esteem. We've talked about self-esteem other places in the course. And there is this kind of myth in our culture that people with low self-esteem are more likely to bully others, which is a form of relational aggression. But the evidence shows the opposite. People with low self-esteem aren't the ones that tend to be the bullies. It's people with high self-esteem. But there's a particular pattern, which is individuals with high and unstable self-esteem. This means that someone has a need to maintain high self-esteem, but their self-esteem level fluctuates a lot based on their circumstances. So they're constantly needing to find new things to boost their self-esteem, to maintain that high level of self-esteem. Imagine a classroom bully, for example, that has high self-esteem and needs to keep their self-esteem high by picking on others to get a sense of power and value. That's why there's that association there. Other personality traits, a lot of reviews look at like the big 5 personality traits. We find that people that are higher in agreeableness tend to be less aggressive towards others. On the other hand, we have traits like neuroticism. People that are higher in neuroticism tend to be more quick to use aggressive or violent responses to others. Now, going back to basics, I mentioned at the start that aggression, one of the reasons that it works both across time and in an individual, we have aggressive options is because usually when you use aggression to get your way, it works a lot of the time. Remembering the principles of operant conditioning, if you perform a behavior and you get a benefit as a result of that behavior, you're more likely to use that behavior again in the future. So if you respond to a situation aggressively and it resolves in your favor, you will more likely be aggressive in the future. One of the reasons you see a difference between person to person and how often they engage in aggressive behavior in adulthood is looking at their history from childhood all the way up to adulthood of how successful were they at getting their way using aggressive options. Now, that's operant conditioning, but what about learning from others, modeling others' behavior? Social learning, or learning from observing other people, is when you don't directly engage in aggression and then get rewarded or not, but if you see someone else engaging in aggression, are you more likely to model their behavior? Well, the answer is yes. This actually leads to a problem I want to mention here, which is the problem of why does the research from developmental psychology overwhelmingly show that kids who are spanked end up having more behavioral problems as adults? If you were spanked as a child, you are more likely to be someone who uses violence against your intimate partners as an adult, for example. What is going on here? It might be that this modeling helps explain this, because if you learn as a child that using violent actions against someone else is an appropriate way to get what you want to happen, then you model that behavior and you're more likely to do that as an adult. You saw other people hitting, spanking to get their way, you might be more likely to use, hitting to get your way again in the future. What are some other cultural differences or individual differences in violence? Well, a lot of the research I'm presenting here, it was done on North American samples, but different cultures have different viewpoints of what kind of violence is acceptable and when that violence is acceptable. So a lot of the information here is highly culturally variable. There are some features of particular cultures that may lead to more or less violence. What about things like an outside source, exposure to violent television, violent video games? There is an association, correlation between exposure to violence in media and engaging in violence, but correlation does not equal causation. So could it be that if you're a more aggressive person, you enjoy violent video games more? Or could it be the opposite direction? Enjoying violent video games causes you to be a more aggressive person. What does the evidence show us? Well, it's hard to establish that violence in media directly causes people to be more violent, because we have to establish how can that be? What is the pathway? One of the explanations that has some evidence in favor of it is the desensitization. That means that it's a general term for if you're exposed to a stimulus again and again, the power of that stimulus has on your brain gets lower. You can be desensitized to violence in media. What that means is that you see violence in media again and again, and eventually it has less of an impact on you psychologically. So not only does seeing violence not bother you as much, but then using violence yourself doesn't impact you and feel as bad. So that's one explanation for this link between violence in media and violence we use ourselves. Now, I've looked at some of the research in particular on the link between violent video games and media, violent video games and violent behavior. And there's another interaction here that's probably familiar to you at this point in the presentation, where it does not appear that violent video games are necessarily what is leading to more violent behavior in laboratory studies. It turns out if you compare a violent and a non-violent video game, and then also choose games that are more frustrating or stressful or less frustrating or stressful, the stress level introduced by the game is a better predictor of whether you'll become aggressive than whether the game itself includes violence. So if we put people in a situation where they're playing a frustrating video game, whether it's violence or not, they may get more aggressive, probably because they're frustrated, matching some of the other information that we've already talked about. I want you to think back for a minute to that example from the beginning of the presentation. Researchers were studying a person and environment interaction leading to aggressive behavior. Their environment variable was putting people in a situation where they were mildly inconvenienced, or, that was a control group, or they were inconvenienced and they were directly insulted by someone else who called them a name. Their person variable, personal history that they divided people based on, was whether they were from the north or the south of the United States, which roughly corresponds to northern or eastern states, southern or western states. What was their reasoning for dividing people up based on this north-south division? There's a lot of history that there are cultural differences between the North and the South in the United States. Just look at the Civil War. They fought against each other, tried to separate into different countries. There are a lot of variables in the cultures of these different regions that are of interest. But the one we're going to talk about that was investigated is the culture of honor. What is culture of honor? That is the degree to which it is viewed in a particular culture, it is acceptable to respond to threats to your honor with aggression and violence. So there's not a huge difference between cultures in whether it's appropriate to respond to physical violence against you with physical violence back. Someone throws a punch at you, it is appropriate all over the world to throw a punch back and defend yourself. But what if someone threatens your honor? It could be, in some locations, threatening the masculinity of a man, or it could be someone threatening your family's honor or threatening your organization's honor. These are all different pieces of this puzzle researchers have studied. Is it appropriate, if someone insults one or all of those things, for you to respond with a punch or a weapon or something like that that is violent? So places where there's a higher culture of honor, it's more appropriate to defend your honor through these violent means. Turns out that in the United States, there is this difference where the northern states don't have a great emphasis on culture of honor, but the southern states do. This includes many western states and what was not necessarily all classified as Southern in, contemporary language, but there's these cultural divides, right? So that's what the researchers were investigating. And in fact, that's what they found, is that in these locations that have this greater culture of honor, in their experimental situation, just like culture of honor would predict, when they were insulted, they became more aggressive. Their stress levels, this is other research matches with this, your stress levels go up, cortisol levels go up, you're more likely to respond with anger, with aggression, with violence when your honor is insulted. So these differences exist. Why do these differences exist? Where do these cultures diverge? Well, one of the theories about this is it's due to the economic livelihood of certain areas. We see in the United States, for example, with the European colonizers of the U.S., the economic powerhouse of the northern and more eastern states was mostly farming and other kinds of trading, where having aggressive tendencies, responding quickly to threats with violence, wasn't a super effective strategy at actually protecting their resources. But in the southern and western states, particularly when the West was being settled by colonizers, livestock like cattle was one of the major drivers of the economy in those places. And being able to protect your herd, like of cattle, having the reputation for if someone tries to take that away from you, you'll respond with violence, is an effective method of guarding your livelihood. We don't just see this in the United States. We see this across the world when we compare cultures that have history of economic activity, where having a reputation for violence, having a reputation that you'll respond with quick brute force, is a way to protect your assets. Those cultures tend to have a greater emphasis on culture of honor. Now, are there other differences? So aggression is one thing. There is evidence that there are some negative associations, harmful associations with the culture of honor in certain places. Now, these studies I'm citing on the slide are all taking place in particular areas. So I can confidently say that culture of honor is associated with higher school shootings per capita in general. But we do know, based on research in the United States, there is that association. We do know that in some areas of the world, there's greater incidence of self-harm, possibly suicide, and greater risk-taking behavior, which may be related to building up your honor building up your reputation might require risk-taking behavior. So it's not just aggression that culture of honor differs on. Bringing in more research connections to this presentation, we talked about desensitization a little bit. I want to tell you about a specific study that psychologists used to study whether desensitization could partially be responsible for why people exposed to violent video games, violent media, respond more aggressively or more violently. There's this association, but we don't know whether one causes another. Now, I want you to look at the two images on this slide. These aren't the real images used by the researchers, hopefully, obviously, but they actually performed a study where participants were asked to judge images of landscapes and to remember which one in a series of landscapes was rotated 90 degrees. This isn't a very difficult task, but they made it more difficult by inserting distracting images into the study to make this memory task more confusing and more difficult. And they included two different types of distracting images. This was their manipulation, which type of distracting image participants saw. They either saw images that were very disturbing because they were things like nasty toilets, dirty toilets, which is very distracting, or they saw disturbing imagery like images from violent video games of violence. What the researchers found is that people who have a history of consuming more violent media were less distracted by images of violence in the study. So everyone was distracted the same amount by images of nasty toilets or images of a disgusting room, served as a confusing image, but people with a history of consuming violent media not as distracted by violent imagery, meaning that their brain took this violent imagery just as normal. They responded less to it. This shows that they had experienced desensitization. Their brain wasn't distracted by this, they performed better, which means probably in everyday life, outside of the laboratory, images of violence, images of graphic things are not really impacting people who consume a lot of violent media in the same way. We talked a lot about person variables or personal history variables. Let's go on and talk about some situation differences. So if you put the same person into one of several different situations, you can increase or decrease that person's tendencies toward aggression. Let's start with connecting to a study you might have heard about in an intro to psych class, maybe even earlier in this class, the topic of obedience to authority. Now, I want to remind you of one of the classic studies, which is Stanley Milgram's studies on obedience to authority. Milgram had participants come into his laboratory and be told they were going to draw names out of a hat of either a teacher or a learner. And you may recall, this was fake, one of the participants was an actor who always said that he drew learner out of a hat. The participant would, oh lucky, because it was a setup, would draw teacher out of the hat. And then Milgram or one of his research assistants would put them through this task where the teacher was administering shocks to a learner who was present in another room. One of the conclusions from this study is that individuals engaged in much more harmful behavior toward others than they themselves expected that they would in everyday life. So if someone is directing you to harm another person, there are social pressures that we've discussed in this class that might push you to be more or less likely to actually inflict that harm on other people. So one of the situational variables we have to think about is whether an authority figure is present or whether there are other social pressures placed upon you in order to inflict pain upon other people. Like I've said, it does appear we have psychological mechanisms that make, for most people, inflicting hurt upon other humans or other animals makes us feel extremely uncomfortable. But if there's enough social pressure, we can push through that uncomfortable feeling and inflict the pain. The next situational difference we'll talk about is the impact of substances. Now, I'm going to focus in particular on alcohol. There's this popular conception that alcohol exposure is related to aggression. There's a lot of truth behind that. Alcohol does affect our tendency toward aggression. Researchers have concluded that it's not that alcohol directly makes someone more aggressive. It's that exposure to alcohol, which I just mean drinking alcohol, affects the way that our brain is processing information. And that is what leads to the aggressive behavior. So it's not like alcohol makes you aggressive by itself. In fact, there's been a lot of research studies that compare people drinking alcohol placed in neutral situations with people exposed to alcohol, drinking a certain amount, and then put in frustrating situations or stressful circumstances. What we find is that if you're in a chill environment, alcohol doesn't change your aggressive tendencies whatsoever. It's only when alcohol is combined with situations where more self-control, controlling your impulses, is necessary. So like extremely stressful situations, like maybe you're out at a crowded bar with a lot of people. And of course, no one is going to be drinking alcohol in a crowded bar with a lot of people. That's not where you drink alcohol, right? I'm obviously kidding. Part of the reason there's this association we have between alcohol and violence is that many of the social situations in which it's appropriate to drink alcohol in many cultures also include this mix of social stressors and environment stressors that when we lose our impulse control due to the alcohol, we're more likely to use aggression to get what we want and respond to situations. Now, next, this is a very old idea in psychology, but still supported to this day. It's the frustration-aggression hypothesis. I've alluded to this throughout a lot of this presentation. It's the idea that aggression is more likely when someone is frustrated. Now, frustrated means both a psychological state, you're stressed out, you're distressed, but it's also a physiological state. Anytime your body is pushed out of homeostasis, that can be negative emotions, that can be stress, that can be you're overheated, things like that. Whenever your body is stressed, you are more likely to respond with aggression. So this includes simple things like laboratory studies have found that when a room is hotter, individuals are more likely to respond aggressively than another group where the temperature is lower. We found this in the lab, and then researchers went and looked at data of crime rates by county in, this has been replicated in different countries. And what we find is if you compare data of crime from year to year, so if you look at the same county during the same month, if it's hotter in a particular year, more crimes are committed, particularly violent crimes. So this has been found in a lab and out in the world. So it could be simple things increasing aggression like heat, overcrowding, and in one really interesting study a couple years ago, even a bad odor in a lab made people more aggressive than a control condition with a neutral smell. Now that I think about it, and there's a lot of research on this as well, even though I didn't include it on the slide here, this is one explanation among many for there is this difference people notice in violent crime rates between urban and rural areas. One of the reasons, one of the contributing factors for urban areas having higher crime rates is the environmental stressors that are associated with urban areas. Traffic and noise, overcrowding, less access to green spaces like parks, trees, and nature. All these things are contributors. None of them cause someone to be aggressive, but all these things are small contributors to frustration levels, which can change the way you're thinking and processing information, which can change your tendency toward aggressive behavior. Before we finish talking about situation variables, I just want to address one idea in particular, and it's the idea of catharsis, this idea that came from early philosophers and psychologists before psychology as a discipline was really as scientifically rigorous as it is today. Catharsis, it's this idea that when you're frustrated, you should express your frustration in healthy ways to make sure that you don't express it in unhealthy ways. So you're very angry and you're afraid that you're about to punch your friend. You should punch a wall instead so that you don't punch your friend. I just want to be very clear, the research shows that this is not correct. It is not a good thing to redirect your anger when you are angry, right? Punching a wall actually sustains your anger. It is unhealthy to direct violence toward alternate sources to get yourself to become less violent. Now, is there a grain of truth in here, right? There are healthy ways of working out your frustration. Going to the gym and having a workout is going to keep your stress levels elevated. It's going to keep you physiologically aroused. But working out at the gym, even though that is a physical activity, it's not related to aggression or violence. That's a way to engage yourself in physical activity to let your emotional state change. So there are healthy ways of dealing with frustration, but punching a pillow, punching a wall, that is just going to sustain your aggressive tendencies. It's not helpful in the short term or the long term. All right, back to situational factors. I want to make sure to mention social rejection. This is another situational factor. So if someone feels socially rejected or ostracized, it influences the way they perceive the world and can make someone's behavior more aggressive or more violent. So this can include, this has been studied in laboratory studies where we do very simple manipulations to make people feel like a group doesn't want to work with them. But there's also research connecting this to real world behavior. When people feel like they're not part of a group, when people feel like they're excluded by their culture, their community, or their family, they're more likely to engage in aggressive behavior. When someone has cues of social rejection, it changes the way they see the world. They're less likely to control their impulses. Now, this leads to kind of something that impacts a lot of these situational variables, which is the influence of priming. It's a concept from cognitive psychology. So priming or salience or cognitive accessibility, these things are all related. This is our finding that when someone is exposed to certain stimuli in their environment, it might bring associations to the front of your mind. So you're more likely to engage in certain behaviors if those thoughts of those behaviors have been primed. In other words, if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. I mean this literally. If we introduce stimuli to your environment to make you think about hammers, you're more likely to think about using a hammer to solve a problem. If, very similarly, but less funny, if thoughts about weapons are primed in someone's environment, then their mind is able to think of aggressive solutions to problems more readily. And because you're ready to think about aggressive solutions to problems, you are then more likely, might be a small effect, but it is a noticeable effect, to actually respond with violence in your environment. The weapons effect is a name for this very particular priming effect, where the mere sight of a weapon is enough to increase your aggressive responses. Priming by itself is pretty neutral. If you're walking through the grocery store and you see hand soap on sale, you might be more likely to wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. If my cat is meowing at me, even if I'm not consciously aware of it because I'm working, I might be more likely to give her a treat later, right? Priming is a very simple mechanism. It affects all kinds of things in your everyday life. It's also affecting your tendency to use violence. Brad Bushman, one of the authors, has been cited a few times in this presentation, I think, because he studies violence and aggression. Talks a lot in some of his published research about the general aggression model, which I think is a perfect example of how a social psychologist is applying this interaction model of person variables and environment variables are always interacting. Things in your environment, such as the sight of a weapon or the frustration that you're going through, or all kinds of variables, are changing how you think and process the world, which is in turn pushing you to being more or less likely to select from certain behaviors. So the general aggression model says that it's not that an individual person is always going to respond with an aggressive response. It's that our environment is constantly interacting with our personal history to push us to be more or less likely to engage in aggressive behavior. All right, that's where we'll end for this presentation. This is just a partial reading list if you want to read more about the topics here about aggression. This is a great example in social psychology of how we have clearly separated a topic into person variables and situation variables, with the understanding that there's always that interaction that has to occur for a behavior to be elicited.